Sorry, I'm trying to do this on 2 computers. Okay. All right. So here we go. And let me start with the PowerPoint. And I changed this. All right. Once again, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming. And we're going to sort of go through the general aspects of the report. Then I'm going to hop over to the reporting, the portal itself, the tool, and show you exactly what it looks like in there. And then we'll finish with some more questions. My intention is to pause for questions after each of the sections. So if you have questions at that point, please either unmute yourself and ask them, or put them in the chat, or raise your hand. I will say if I have the PowerPoint going, it's possible I won't see the chat. So it may be worthwhile to just unmute yourself. But here we go. So hopefully everybody's seeing the PowerPoint right now. So Public Libraries Annual Report. Welcome. So what is the annual report? Again, I'm going to say a lot of things that a lot of you probably already know. I apologize, but I want to make this as general as possible for people who are new to it. So what is the annual report? Report is a sort of statistical overview of everything that people think is interesting, or at least that we can capture statistically, of a public library. Every public library in the country participates in the program. Each state has a person who is in charge of sort of collating the information for all of their individual libraries. And not every library participates every year, but in general, every library is eligible, and we try to get everybody to participate. The questions in the report, most of the questions come from IMLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services, sort of not our boss exactly, but they're the ones who oversee this overall program. They develop the questions with input from the state data folks at each state library. So every year, and you'll see this later, every year there are a few changes about how we're going to do it. Questions get added, subtracted, etc. In addition to that, so there's a bunch of questions that IMLS asks, and they ask everyone. And then there are questions, every state library is welcome to add its own questions. So about a third, maybe a quarter of the questions are ones that Vermont has added on its own. Yeah, so that's generally what the report is. So what happens with the report data afterwards? And I'll talk much later on. I talk sort of the process of how this all works, where the data goes, etc. But who uses the data? So first off, at the federal level, IMLS uses the data, and the federal government uses the data to sort of analyze what public libraries do, what they're accomplishing, how things are working, etc. What's new and otherwise. The other thing is that other state and public libraries nationwide use the data. So if you're in Arizona, but you're in a rural part of Arizona, you may discover that there's a library or a series of libraries in Vermont that give really good benchmarks or really good comparisons. And so the fact that we're all looking at the same data throughout the nation means that you can draw conclusions based on a much broader range of data than if you were just looking at Vermont. Who else uses it? At the state level, we use it, the Department of Libraries. Also, state government uses it to figure out what libraries are doing, what they're accomplishing, and what's new, what's the same, etc. And then lastly, who uses the local data? Your library uses the local data, and members of the public can use this data to figure out what libraries are doing, how their library compares to all the other libraries in the state or in the country. But yeah, basically, so there's a lot of potential users for the data. Okay, now into the sort of nuts and bolts. When is the report due? first off, the report happens every year. There are other reports in the library world that don't happen every year, but this one is an every year situation. This time around, the opening date was October 28th, so we're already open. The closing date is December 31st of, not 2022, sorry, 2021. So this December 31 is the last date, and then there's an extension available up to January 14th, which to get the extension, just ask for it. Just let me know that you'd like the extension. You can tell me that anytime. If you think that you want it, just ask and you go on the list of people who have an extension. January 14th is pretty much we're not going to have a lot of leeway after January 14th this time around. We've tried to move the date up. The date historically was about now, but over time, the last few years, it's drifted further and further back, so that last year we were doing this in February, but we're trying to move it back and recorrect it. So yeah, that's the dates that we're looking at. If you need an extension, just email me, and then you'll be good. All right, so this is a kind of complicated question. What time period does the report cover? It is in fact maybe the most confusing piece of the report in many cases, and it's certainly the one that can trip people up. So many libraries in Vermont have many different fiscal years. For the report, everybody should basically be using whatever your actual fiscal year. What do you use to track money and everything else that you do? So a lot of libraries use the calendar year, January 1 to December 31st. A lot of libraries use what is sort of the traditional fiscal year. That's July 1 of this year to June 30th of the next year. A few libraries use the federal fiscal year, which is October 1 of this year to September 30th of the last year. And then there are other ones that just fall. It's always 12 months, but it can vary and fall in different spots. So first off, you need to know what your fiscal year is. And then what period are you doing? You are doing you're doing the last fiscal year that ended before October 15th. So if you follow the July to June or October to September or a number of other dates, it's pretty straightforward. You just use last year to this year, July of last year to June of this year, for example. However, if you do the calendar year, for the most people, you want to be submitting last year's data. So in this case, that would be 2020. There are a few libraries who are off schedule, and I've talked to them before. But in general, if you do the calendar January to December year, you want to do you're always submitting last year's data. I know that's sort of confusing, but it just works out that way because of the way that this works and the way that we've scheduled the report. So if you ever have questions about your reporting period, contact me immediately. Basically, contact me before you're doing anything else, because we want to make sure that you're looking at the right year before you start doing any of the data. Yes, okay, so that's it for reporting period. Okay, so this is updated questions from last year. So if you're familiar with the report from last year, this will mean something to you. And if not, you can just sort of vaguely skim it. What's changed since last year? IMLS has dramatically increased the number of categories under programming. And I'll show you what that looks like, but we've added new age categories. Ages 0 through 5 is a new category. Usually before it was just children, punk, and now it's broken into 2 age groups. There's also an option for general audience, which is if you're not targeting any specific age range, or family events is sometimes called that. And then additionally in programming, there are now 3 separate locations. There are on-site, off-site, and virtual. Last year, everything was assumed to be on-site, and we added a virtual category, but now there are 3 different, and that'll make sense when we get to programming. The other big change is that they are now tracking non-traditional items, physical items. That's everything from muffin tins to snowshoes to puzzles to anything else that gets circulated but is not a traditional book, DVD, etc. One more thing, we sort of slimmed down what we're asking in the grants received section, and we'll talk about that when we get there. We used to ask how much money you received for each grant that you received, and now we put them into categories. So how much money did you receive for state grants, federal grants, other grants? And you don't, we're hoping that that's just fewer questions and might be easier to manage. There's a new question where we ask whether you charge fines. We don't ask you how much you charge, we just ask whether it's basically a yes, no. So, let's see. And fines. Oh, formerly we asked what's new and what successes have you had at the very end of the report. We have taken that out of the report because it seemed kind of cruel after you finish the entire report to have this long narrative question. So we have gotten rid of that. But what we're going to do instead is ask that as a separate survey. So you won't have to be, you could do that at a totally separate time. Let's see, COVID questions are still in the report. We simplified a little bit of language, but that's basically where we're at. All right, so next. Okay, so here are, these are a couple of important things to remember about the report in general. First off, this says, if you need login information, ask Josh, and that's totally true. I've sent login information to what I had for contacts for everybody with an email, but if you didn't get it or you lose it or whatever, get in touch with me and I can tell you what it is. It's the same as last year. It's always, the logins don't change, but they, let's see. Oh, is the PowerPoint disappearing for some people? Unfortunately, I don't have a good handle on that, why it would not be keeping that. You could, in general, in Teams, if you ever are in a Teams and it's not doing what you want, one approach is to, you're hearing me in an echo. One approach is to go out and go back in. So that's, unfortunately, that's often my best advice. It's basically like restarting, but for Teams. Anyway, okay, so yeah. So if you need login information, ask me. But more broadly, if you have questions at any point, ask me. Don't ever feel like you need to wait. Don't ever feel like you need to try it on your own. I want you to just ask me questions. So feel free to email or call or whatever anytime. I would much rather that you send me 5 emails than that I discover that you just spent 2 hours trying to do a thing that you couldn't do or wrestling with some problem that would not, that you couldn't resolve. So if that's happening, please just get in touch. Okay, next, basics of the report. You can work on the report in any order. You can jump through it. It's totally fine. You don't need to do it in any order. It is presented in an order, but you can go back and forth. You can do this section, that section, etc. You can stop and come back to it whenever you want. You don't have to, you're not doing it all in one. It's not like one of those horrible forms where you're like, you have 15 minutes and you have to do it all at once. You can do it through the whole process. We'll show you this before. Whenever you go forward or backward in the report, it automatically saves it. Or when you hit save, it automatically saves it. But it's never a bad idea to hit that. If you just close the window, it's not going to save anything. I'll show you where this is, but there's a button that says show last year's answers in the upper right-hand corner. I would turn that on all the time. It just tells you what you answered last year, and it gives you a little bit of, it just gives you context. You know what you did last year. If your numbers this year are totally different because of COVID, that might be totally reasonable, but it'll just maybe help with what you're, it'll give you a little bit more context there. Again, I did include it. If you aren't sure about something, always ask me. Just ask me. That's great. I appreciate it. I will lastly say we used to have individual instructions. There used to be a button for each question, but we took care. I removed that because it was getting out of date and tried to make the questions so they're obvious what they mean. That being said, they're still not always obvious. So never, ever hesitate. There are no dumb questions about the report. The report is not intuitive. Please really, really feel free to ask me questions at any time. Thank you on that. So Kim just pointed out, if the PowerPoint disappears and you only see Josh, it may be found in the lower right-hand corner of the screen by our initials. It should appear as a PowerPoint symbol. I think they changed the way that that's worked, so I apologize on that, but thank you for pointing that out. All right, so that's basics of the report. Okay, sections on the report. We'll go through those individually, but I'll just want to say this is generally the order of things in the report. And I won't belabor that because we're going to go through them one by one. But that's that's where we're at. So I think I'm going to jump into the report now and do it section by section, and then we'll get sort of more general questions as well as section. We'll do each section questions at the end of each section, and then we'll save general questions for sort of the end of the process, if that's okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go in. I'm going to go into the actual report portal, and that way you'll see what it really looks like. So I am unsharing this. Oh, stop presenting. Thank you. Okay, and so now we're going to hop into the portal. The portal looks much the same as last year for anybody who worked on it last year. Sorry, this is slowing a little bit. Okay. All right, now we are okay. Now we're in here. So this is what you're going to see when you go to the portal anytime. It basically always looks the same. So everybody has their login and password. So when you go in, you're only going to see the one library. You're not going to see, again, you're not going to see every other option. So, but you will see multiple years. So I'm going to go in to jump in, but so you want to pick the most recent year. You shouldn't be able to see, do anything with the previous years because they should all be locked. So 2021 is what you want. First section is directory information or sort of contact information. This is basically the address, phone number, name of the library, information like the current librarian, the current chairperson of the Board of Trustees, the type of library that you are. You'll find that the contact information at the beginning is already pre-filled, so you don't have to do that again. However, if you've moved or anything is wrong, let me know and I can fix it, but you can't change it. But the rest of it you can. So we'll hop ahead. So there's a bunch of sort of general contact information. This is who's the librarian as of today, who is the president of the Board of Trustees as of today. Then we get into date and times that you were open. This up until 2 years ago, this was really straightforward, but COVID made this much more complicated. So what we want you to do is, first off, how many weeks is your library open during a normal year? So if you're closed for part of the year, you would want to take that into account. Otherwise, the answer is 52. The next one is, how many weeks was your library closed due to COVID? Closed means patrons can't physically go in the building proper, not a vestibule. If they're picking up, no version of curbside counts as this really. So this is how many weeks were you literally physically closed to patrons. There are a lot of nuances there. So if you have a question about whether does this count? Just get in touch with me because it can get a little bit complicated. The next one is, how many weeks were you physically open, but you had some sort of limitations? This covers a lot of ground under COVID. Were there reduced hours? Was there maximum occupancy? Was there time limits? Were your stacks closed? Were there appointments? Basically, if you were making any changes around COVID, it counts as there were some sort of limitations going on. So this is a number of weeks as well. And that will give you the number of weeks that you were open for the year. Okay, now we're going to do hours. Basically, we're asking three things here. How many hours were you open normally without appointment during the year? Next, how many hours were you open for appointment but not open normally? And then lastly, how many hours were you open for curbside but not open normally or by appointments? So basically, we don't want to double count your hours. We want you to count whichever of these is the most open. So, and again, if you have questions about what that looks like, let me know. But at the end, and ultimately, this is the total number of hours for the year that you were open, not for any given week, for the year. And yeah, so that's that. Again, questions about this. This is still a little bit confusing, particularly with COVID. So get in touch and I will try to clarify which category something falls into. Next, if you had a bookmobile or branch, how many total hours did it operate and how many weeks was it open? These are a little bit new, but again, only apply to the 3 libraries that have bookmobiles and the 3 libraries that have branches. Okay, page 2 of directory information. Oh, that's an important little hiccup. For some reason, the first time you're on page 1, you say next, it always takes you back to page 1. There's a bug. We haven't quite resolved it. You need to do it again. So my apologies for that, but that is still in there from last year. Okay, more directory information, part 2. The beginning date for your reporting period and the end date for your reporting period. So this matches up with whatever data you were telling us. And it should match up with your fiscal year. Again, it sort of follows the conversation we had earlier about what is the reporting period. But this is beginning and end. Again, if you have any questions ever about your reporting period, ask me. We can figure out what you did last year. We can figure out what you should be doing this year, and ask me before you get into the report, because it will get very confusing very quickly. Lastly, what is the population of your legal service area? I fill that in. You don't need to touch that. I update it every year. We haven't had the update for the coming year, so this is actually showing you last year's data, but that's something we do. So that was directory information. Does anybody have questions about the sort of directory information, the part of the report that we just went through, and hours and weeks? If you do, please, you can just unmute yourself or put something in the chat. Let's see, I'm going to go back for a second and see if anything's in chat. Okay, that is one of the more straightforward sections. So okay, so we're going to hop ahead. Section 2, or B, sorry, is staffing. What we're looking for here is how many hours a week you had of staff hours in these categories. We're looking for during a week, not total hours for the year. First off, it's looking for, let's see, librarians. Librarian is, the definition of librarian is a little bit fuzzy. To some degree, if you treat someone as a librarian, if in your organization they are a librarian, then you can put them under the librarian category. In general, directors are always treated as librarian, even if that's not their title. And otherwise, people with a significant amount of responsibility can be as a librarian. We have them under 3 categories. Category 1 is librarians who have a master's degree in library science or an MLIS. That's category 1. Category 2 are librarians who don't have an MLS, but do have a certificate of public librarianship through the department. So they would be in category 2. Category 3 are librarians who do not have a master's degree, a master's library degree, or a certificate. If they have a master's in something else, or if they have any other background, they want to go in that 3rd category. So again, we're looking for the weekly hours that they have for this, weekly paid hours. So that's librarians. Next, hold on, I think we have somebody that I have to allow in. Sorry about that. Okay, all right, so the next category is other staff, which is everyone else, everyone who is not called a librarian. So everything: clerks, security staff, you know, your cataloger, your every other library position, if they are not treated or called librarian, goes under here. So generally, this is a bigger number in many cases. Again, we're looking for weekly hours. So you add up all the staff that work there, how many hours do they work, and you give us a number. If there were, in general, what we're trying to get at here is your normal hours, your typical hours. If there were furloughs for a chunk of the year, but this is still your normal budgeted hour, you don't need to account for the furloughs. If there's a staff member who, for some reason, only worked for a chunk of the year, you had an intern, you had a you know, AmeriCorps person, you had somebody who was only there for a chunk of year, and they're not going to come back. What you should do is figure out their total hours and then average that throughout the year. So if they worked, divide it into 52 weeks and figure out what their average would have been and add that into your total. Next, total number of staff paid with funds outside the library budget. This doesn't happen super often, but you may have people who are AmeriCorps folks. You may have people who are totally grant funded or who are just funded by some other organization. So if the money never goes through the library, this is where we want those people to be. And we, again, just want their paid, their weekly hours. Lastly is volunteer hours. So we want the average number of volunteer hours in a week. I know that can be hard to get a sort of average there, but we just want you to sort of add everything together, come up with a rough average per week for the year. This includes, you know, standard volunteers, people who do shelving, people who do, but also board members or people who work behind the scenes, people who do book repair. Any volunteers that you have, we want to get those here if you can. So, okay, so that is, there's only one page for staffing, so that's for staffing. If people have questions about, does anybody have questions about staffing?
Josh, yes, I do.
Yeah.
What about when you hire a sub who comes in and subs for the director? Would that just go under general paid staff?
Yes. Yep. I would put them under, and yeah. Let's see. So we have the director is off. We are replacing them. I mean, we're temporarily covering for them with a sub.
Correct.
Yeah, I would probably put them under general staff. I think just for clarity's sake, that would probably be the most coherent. I guess if you had them, if they were really like a long-term, if they were making sort of librarian decisions, maybe you would want to lump them under a librarian, but I think my default would probably be normal, sort of the regular staff category.
Okay. Thank
you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And would that be averaged out if you had a sub that, say, came in like even once a month, very sporadically, and covered for the director? Would those monthly, you could just look at that and average it out over the year, like you mentioned before? Okay.
Yep. Yeah. If for any reason you're getting somebody who isn't in all the time but is in a fair amount and consistently, like regularly, I would average it out and put it in as a weekly average over the year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you much. Any other questions on staffing? Okay, we will hop ahead. Thank you much. Okay, this one is actually the easiest one. It is called space. It is just the current square footage of your building. This one is already entered in there. But if you had a recent addition, or if you think that maybe it's wrong, which it sometimes is, get in touch with me and we can try to correct it. But it's pre-filled, so you don't have to do anything here in general. Okay, so now we're hopping ahead to the first of the financial categories. This is income. So in general, this is intended to cover almost all the income that your library might have in a given year. There are a couple of weird things that might not fall in here, but in general, it should capture most of what you're doing. The first, and in many, though not all cases, the largest, is local tax support. So this is all the funding that you receive from a municipality should go here. Everything that, yes. So if you have more than one municipality that you get money from, you just want to hit right here where it says add group, you hit that, and you can add an additional town and add an amount. You can, in theory, there are libraries who get money from 5 or 6 different municipalities, so just keep adding and it should be fine. If you added one that you don't need, you can just hit remove group. But so basically, this is the name of the town, and then this is the total amount that you're getting for this year. So that's, in many cases, is a majority of your budget. In some cases, for some incorporated libraries, is not that large an aspect of what you're doing. Okay. So that's D1 through 3. Okay, so next, from there, we go into the other funds. The first one is non-resident borrower fees. So this is if you charge non-resident patrons to use the library. And there's it's broken down into a couple of categories. If you charge per borrower, this is whatever your fee is. If you charge them $30 a year, $40 a year, whatever the charge is, put it here. If instead you charge per family, you put it here. And then this is the total of everybody that you were charging your non-resident fee that you got from non-resident fees. So what portion of your overall revenue comes from non-resident fees? If you don't charge them, you want to put zeros in all of these. Oh, that's something that I should have said earlier. I think we can talk about this later. In general, if the answer is, what am I trying to say? If the answer is you don't do it, you typically want to put in a 0, or in some cases, it's a -1, but they'll sort of coach you on which you want to put in. 0 typically means we didn't do that. I mean, sorry, that none of them happened. There was no money that came through in something. And -1 means we don't do that at all. But in this case, 0 is what you want, because you can't put a -1 in a financial category because it goes crazy. And I probably just confused you all. I apologize. But we'll talk about that more later, what to do if a question doesn't apply to you. Okay, so we did non-resident borrowing. Next is all other local income. This is a huge category, but it is private support, donations, things like that, gifts, fines, fees, fundraising, book sales. This is everything else basically that you were getting from not necessarily even the community, but most other income. There's a separate section for grants. This doesn't include grants, but it does include almost everything else. So that all goes here. Okay, so this next one, this grayed out. I should have talked about this before. The system adds up things for you. These grayed out ones, the system should add up on its own, and you don't need to do anything. In fact, you can't actually change them. If you see one that looks wildly wrong, get in touch with me, and we'll figure out why it might be wildly wrong. Usually, it just means it hasn't added something yet. Okay, next, transfers. Transfers are one of the weirder aspects. Transfers are when you are taking money out of an endowment, or if you have money from a previous year, those go into transfers. This gets in the weeds almost instantly. So in most cases, if you're not sure if something applies on a transfer, just get in touch with me and we will try to hash it out. But in general, the main design was to get things that were coming out of an endowment fund or a savings account or an investment account or something like that. And that's just the total for the year. Next, grants. We've changed up how we asked grants. I mentioned this earlier. We used to have a little, tell us how much you made, you got for the summer reading grant. How much did you get for the courier grant? How much did you get for the, this or the other? And instead, now what we're doing is you just check the ones that you received, and then you give us a total. So the totals are for state administered grants, federal administered grants, and all other grants. And it sort of coaches you which fall into those categories. So there's at least fewer questions this time around, and we just need totals. They were getting totaled up anyway, so this hopefully is relatively straightforward. But if you have questions about any of that, obviously let me know. Next, and the last piece of operating income is in-kind support. This is something that we try to capture, which is if somebody does something for you you would normally be charged, but they're doing it for free, you want to put this under in-kind support. Every different kind of in-kind support, we want to put in here. So if somebody plows your driveway and they don't charge, put that in here. If somebody works on your website and they don't charge, put that in here. If there's anything else like that, we want to try to capture that to the best of your ability. If you don't know how much do your best on what pricing would be. I mean, if you're not, how much you would have paid for snow plowing, etc., marketing, what have you. If your municipality does does things for you that are not in the budget, provide services for the library that are not in the budget, those would be included as in-kind support. And that's a change that we made a couple years back. But if you have questions, obviously let me know and we will figure them out. And that is the end of income. Do people have questions about income? If you do, either unmute yourself or put something in the chat. Okay, we're going to hop ahead. Thanks, everybody. Okay, the next one is relatively short. This is capital revenue, revenue for capital projects. Many years, a lot of libraries don't have any capital revenue at all. So you just put a bunch of zeros. Capital revenue is typically for construction projects. Obviously, it's either for expansions, remodelings, or even new buildings. But it can be for any other large one-time expense. So if you're getting automated, you're putting in a new ILS or something like that, you're replacing all of your computers, or something else that is a one-time thing that you're not going to do again next year. And if you put it in your budget, it'll make your budget look really big for 1 year. In general, that's where capital revenue goes. Again, capital revenue is broken down by local government revenue, state government revenue, federal government revenue, and then other capital revenue. These, again, are overall, if you received capital revenue, this is where it goes. There's another spot for capital expenses, which we'll show in a minute. Okay, I'm going to hop ahead, but does anybody have questions about capital revenue? It is not the most active question on the report, I'll say. Okay, we're going to hop ahead. This is the last of the financial sections. This is expenditures. So we already asked you how much came into the building, and now we're asking how much went out. So the first two big ones are collection expenditures. So these are broken into the amount that the library spent on print materials, the amount that you spent on electronic resources. Electronic resources includes downloadables, Overdrive, Hoopla, Canopy, online databases that you have a subscription to, Ancestry, Consumer Reports, online magazines, any of the streaming services. Pretty much anything in that vein counts as electronic resources. So we want to get your what you have there. Don't include things like your ILS or computers that you bought or networking equipment or anything that has to do with your actual computers or that in the building. These are electronic resources that your patrons get access to, and we just want to know what you're paying for it. Third, other materials. Other materials are predominantly DVDs, CDs, audiobooks, playaways, but also include non-traditional items like gardening equipment, snowshoes, muffin tins, etc. So ideally, you break your collection expenditures into these three categories: print, electronic, and other. If you can't do that, if you are not sure either, if you can't do a breakdown at all, or one of them you don't know the answer to, then what you want to do is go into FO4, which is a total. You just put the total there. You put zeros in the other ones, and you put your total here. And if there's any of this is actually going to be a theme because there's a bunch of other category questions that work this way. But if you're missing any of them, you just want to put in a total. So that's fine. It works fine. It's just if you can't break it down, that's how we do it. So that should be collections expenditures, relatively large aspect of what you're doing. Second is employee expenditures. So again, this is for all your paid employees. We want to know, first off, salary and or wages, the total for the year. The second is benefits. Benefits include sort of what traditional benefits, insurance, retirement, et cetera. But it also includes the employer contributions to Social Security and Medicare, which means if you have any employees, even if they do not get retirement or insurance or anything, they should still be here for Social Security and Medicare. So there shouldn't be a zero here if you have any staff at all. If you can't get that number, then what you want to do is put it in the total. And again, that's a number that you're probably going to need to talk to the town for. If you are a municipal, there are a number of financial numbers in here that maybe you don't even ever see unless you ask them, because it's just handled behind the scenes. So you'll need to reach out to whoever finances the municipality. Yes, so once again, we either put information in salary and in benefits, or we put a total in FO8. We don't do both. And that's it for employee expenditures. Next, again, there's a big catch-all. All other operating expenditures, everything else. This is just the way that IMLS asks it. I know. So all this, any money that you spend on your building maintenance, if heat, office supplies, and computer costs, networking, anything else like that. A lot of things that if you have a contractor or a consultant working, they are probably in here as well. It's a huge amount. Anything that is not collections or salary is pretty much in here. So it also tends to be pretty high. Next, okay, funds spent on grant projects. So this is everything that you had that you got a grant for. In general, the easiest way to do it is everything you got a grant for, list it as a project here and put that amount. So we had a summer performer grant for $200, right? Summer performer grant, $200, and don't include it anywhere else. So that's the easiest approach. If you had a grant that was not one of ours, you should also put that in here and the amount. We're sort of evolving the way that we're handling grants in the report. This may get changed next year, but we felt like we already had enough change, so we didn't do anything with this. But again, every project, grant project, if you can, put it in here. Don't include it in the other section. We don't want it double counted because it all gets added together. And then I think that's the end of us. Oh, sorry. One last one is capital expenditures. If you got capital revenue and you did something with it this year, you want to put capital expenditures. So you either, you built a ramp, or you got a new room, or you got a new roof. And because you got capital revenue, you want it to be in here. And that is the end of operating expenditures. If people have questions about operating expenditures, please unmute yourself or put something in chat. All right, we are going to hop ahead. Thank you very much. Oh, unless anybody, nope, okay. Thank you. Okay, so that's the end of financial. Either the good or bad, I don't know, but it's that we are no longer in that section. So this section is holdings in the library collection. So this is basically a bunch of how many of X, Y, or Z are in your collection. Ideally, when do you look? When do you get this number? Ideally, at the end of your reporting period, but in many cases, if you don't have that, it's just as soon as you can after that, or right now. Chances are that in most cases your collection size didn't change dramatically in between now and then, but ideally it's the last day of your reporting period, give or take. But whatever number you have is fine. Okay, first one is print materials. Ideally broken into adult and children books, but if you can't break it down by adult and children, you just put them in here. Again, like the previous ones, you either fill out adult and children or you fill out the total here. You don't do both because I'll just have to come change them. Okay, so again, print materials, pretty straightforward. Video items. Video items are DVDs, Blu-rays, video playaways, if anybody has those, VHS tapes, if anybody still has those, or anything else that is a physical item that patrons get to watch a video. Again, break them down by adult and children if you can, or totals if you can't. All right, downloadable or streaming video items. This one is almost always 0 for everyone because of the way IMLS has written the question. It's they want to know items that are available for video items that are available for download or streaming that you have where you have purchased the item. So basically in the kind of the model that Overdrive typically has used, but not where it's pay per use like Canopy or Hoopla. So because of the way that they phrase that, again, it's usually a 0 for everyone, but there might be services where you buy an individual item. Again, not a lot, but IMLS asks it. We usually go to 0s for everybody. Okay, next, audio items. Same format, adult, children, or totals. This is both audio books that are on CD, MP3 disc, playaway, some other physical format, as well as music, which could be CDs, records, tapes, 8 tracks. I don't know what you have. Anything else that's like an audio item that physically gets lent out to patrons. Okay, next. All right. Okay, so downloadable ebooks and audiobooks. So there's first one is there's just a checkbox to say what you participate in. And this is just there so that I kind of can double check your numbers and make sure that you're capturing what your consortium, if you're part of a consortium, what your consortium has. So if you're part of Listen Up Vermont through GMLC, click that. If you were part of RB Digital Overdrive through the Department of Libraries, check that. If you do something on your own, check that. And then what we want is the total number of downloadable ebooks and the total number of downloadable audio items available to your patrons. Again, if you're part of a consortium, we want to know the entire collection. If you have purchased individual items in addition to that, it's called Overdrive Advantage and Overdrive. Ideally, if you can get those numbers, we'd like to add those in there too. They're not huge compared to the consortium numbers. I have the consortium numbers available. I haven't quite updated. There's a page on our website where they're there. So if you just want those numbers, you can just go get them. Again, they're not there yet. I haven't put them up yet, but I will shortly. So that's that. Hopefully that's relatively straightforward. Next is print serial subscriptions, which is magazines or newspapers. In a lot of cases, I bet this number has gone down dramatically during COVID. In a lot of libraries it has, but in some places maybe not. So we want to know how many magazines or newspapers you subscribe to, not how many issues you have. We just want to know, say I have 3 newspapers and 5 magazines. We want to put 8. That's the number that you're getting. And this should be, again, it's ones that you were getting for the whole year. If you can break it down by adult and children, that's great. If you can't, just give us a total. That's fine. Do not include electronic serial subscriptions. These are physical. That's what we're looking for. Next, non-traditional items. How many non-traditional items do you have for checkout by patrons? If, again, covers everything, but if they go out as a set, they count as one thing. So if there's like, oh, we have a whole kitchen thing with spoons and bowls and da-da-da, and they go out as a set, that is one item, just to clarify. So that's how it works. We want those here. Okay, next, databases. If you purchase, so first off, state electronic collections. These are the ones that are either Vermont Online Library or Learning Express or Universal Class. So this is already filled in for everybody. These are the ones that you get through us. But all the ones that you get that you might purchase on your own for your library, we want to go in here, 1 per database. So if you do Hoopla, that's 1. If you do Canopy, that's 1. If you do Zinio, Ancestry, anything that your patrons are able to use that you pay for, that they can access, we want to put that here. So yeah, so that is basically that. And is that the end of? Yeah. So that was the end of holdings. Does anybody have questions about holdings? Either unmute yourself or pop into the chat. Okay, we're gonna hop ahead to services. All right, services. Okay, services is basically everything that you do for patrons, basically, more or less. So it covers a lot. You will find it has 6 different pages to it. So thanks for dealing with it. In general, we want a count if you have a count. Otherwise, what we would like you to do is you can sort of do a poll, like a survey, where you pick a week, you figure out how many you do in that week, you pick another week, figure out how many you do in that week, and you multiply what your yearly average would be. In general, we want a real count, or we want an estimate that you feel like you have some faith in. If it's an estimate that you feel like you believe in enough that you would plan around it internally, you would use internally, that's good enough for us. If it's an estimate that you've given because you feel like you have to give an estimate, we probably don't want that. So if there's a number that you think that you don't have, or that you don't have a good number for, just don't enter it. It's fine. Don't worry about that. We would much rather have not a number than a made up number that ends up being wildly off what you're doing. So, and you can ask me more about that later. But first one is registered borrowers. These are hopefully split into adult and children. And then if not, you can just give us a total. If you have family cards, there are some libraries who just have 1 card per family. You want to say, you want to put in a -1, which is for total, which is we don't know, because family cards could be for 1 person, they could be for 5 people. You don't really have a good handle on individuals. So it's better if you just say, we don't have that number. This is as of your number, the best number that you have. IMLS, ideally, you are removing expired patrons on a semi-regular basis, and that's something that we can talk about, but ultimately we want the best number you have, and that's true for basically everything. Okay, so that was registered patrons. Next, we have annual visits. How many people visited the library for any reason? This is, and this sort of got clarified with COVID, this is physically entering the library. They have to come in to the building. If they don't come to the building, they do not count under this category. We used to include people who were like on your property for programs, things like that. They clarified that you have to come into the building. If you're not in the building, you don't count. In a sense, it's imagining that you have a people counter on your door. Would they get triggered by the people counter? Yes. Okay, then they're a visit. No, then they don't. Okay, then it asks first off what that number is. Next, it asks if it's an actual count or an estimate based on an average week. So if you do a week and then you kind of extrapolate out, you want to put estimate here. If it's an actual count, you want to say actual count. This only affects what IMLS does with the numbers afterwards. Next, COVID question. How many people, to the best of your knowledge, picked up items without entering the building, so via curbside? Do the best you can with this. I know that this number is not one that is normally in your repertoire, so it may be, you may not have it, but if you can come up with something, that's great. Next, reference transactions. This is one that I think that a number of libraries don't capture as well as they might, because you're really busy, and I understand it. It's hard to answer reference questions and then track them all, but best you can do is great. We sort of talk about what is a reference question. The answer is, we sort of talk it through here. A lot of things are reference questions. If you did work on it, it's probably a reference question. If you have to do research, it's probably a reference question. If it's really just directional, where is the bathroom? How do I find your website? If it's that's not a reference question. If it's solely procedural, how does your drop-off work? How do I get onto Overdrive, etc.? That's not a reference question. If it's super basic, like, do you have this book? Not, do you have a book about turtles having an adventure? But do you have this book? If you didn't, so again, that's the difference between reference or not reference. Basically, I know it can get into the weeds very fast, but that's roughly how it goes. We want to know total number, annual total number, again, and then also, is it an actual count or an estimate? Okay, next, online circulation usage. This is how many times did people sort of check out items, downloadable items through your services. So Overdrive, RB Digital, Hoopla, Canopy, Cineo, anything where items are checked out. This is that. If you, in general, I can point you in a direction, but I don't have access to any of these except for folks who are on the department's RB Digital or Overdrive service. Otherwise, you're probably going to end up having to go into your Hoopla account, or your Canopy account, or your ListenUp account. Okay, so that is how many times did things circulate. The next one is use of online databases, either whether they were provided by the state or purchased by the consortium, or like Mango, or individually if you have consumer reports. Do the best you can with those numbers. I can help with the ones that go through the state. I can grab those for you or point you in the direction of how to get them. And then the other ones, the consortium ones or the individual ones, you're on the hook for those. I will say that Universal Class doesn't have stats because they don't get broken down by library. So unfortunately, we don't have any numbers for that. Okay, next, physical circulation. This is adult physical items, children's physical items, or total of adult and children. This is how many times did they get circulated. This first number should include non-traditional items, and then there is a separate question down here that breaks out circulation for non-traditional items. So this one, it's okay, you're not double counting. You want to put them both places. So if your muffin pans went out 10 times, you want that here in H15B, and then you also want to include it up here in whichever category you would put it in. So yeah, so that is that. Next, okay, circulation of that. Curbside. So this is the number of circulations for curbside, if you can get a hold of it. This includes curbside, patron delivery, or any other non-traditional technique that you were probably doing since COVID started. That's what we're looking for. Again, this number should also appear up here under your normal circulation numbers, because you're probably getting those from the ILS. So again, it's not double counting if you have it in both places. Next. Okay. ILL numbers. All right. First one is how many ILLs did you send to other libraries? The second is how many ILLs did you receive? If you can capture if you're in a consortium that does specifically thinking of Catamount, that does consortial lending, I would like, if you can get that number, please include that here under ILLs. They're ILLs by a different name. If you're able to get that, that's great. If not, it's not the end of the world, like everything. But yeah, include those numbers here because it's just going to be easier for you to get them than for us to try to track them through Clover. Okay, next, and the most complicated of the questions under services. Programming. So as I said earlier, IMLS just dramatically increased the number of programming questions because they wanted to capture a few other things. So, so now we have programming. First off, I'll say is broken into two basic categories or sections. There is how many programs did you have, and there's what was the attendance at those programs. So this first page is how many programs did you have. It was included under, so this first one is broken down by, in both cases, sorry, they're going to be broken down by on-site, which is in your building, offsite, just somewhere else, and virtual, which is live programs that you had on Facebook or YouTube or Zoom or anything like that. A live virtual event that people were interacting with in real time. That's where that goes here. Okay, so there's the 3 categories, the onsite, offsite, and virtual. And then each of them is broken down by ages. So the important thing to remember both here and in attendance, program and attendance, is that it's who is the program aimed for. We don't care how old the people who came went. We just want to know who the program was aimed at. And that accounts for both programs and for attendance. And so we'll talk about this under attendance, but if you had a program aimed for 6 to 11-year-olds, but you got a bunch of 40-year-olds, they still count under 6 to 11-year-old attendance because that's the way the questions are set up. So, okay, so we ask for ages 0 through 5, ages 6 through 11, 12 to 18, 19 and older, or a general audience. And a general audience is sort of if it's family or every age or intergenerational, anything where there's not really a good feel for it. Otherwise, you should kind of go based on, you know, if it's go to sit on Santa Claus. I guess ultimately use your judgment about who is really being targeted for it. If it's targeting kids but parents show up, it's probably a kids program. Again, we have changed the categories since last year. Last year, there were children 0 to 11, teens 12 to 18, adults 19 plus, and there was no general audience. So you may not have answers for some of these because we only told people about it in the summer when IMLS added the questions. So if you don't have those categories, don't worry, just leave those new ones blank. Put all of your children in 6 to 11, leave children 0 through 5 alone, and leave general audience alone, and we will make it all work on the back end. So that's that. So again, we have on-site, off-site, and virtual. And then it adds them all up in here. So these are a bunch that you don't need to field. Next page is attendance. So it's asking for attendance and using the same categories. And again, if an adult is at a children's program, they end under children's program attendance because that's what we're tracking. It's also same categories, on-site, off-site, and virtual. I'm sorry, I know that this is a lot. These categories got dramatically more involved than last year, and we're just going to do our best, which is what we do with everything on the report. And thank you for facing this super long section. Okay, next is recorded programming. Recorded programming is two things. It's either programming that was originally broadcast live, virtual programming, like you had it on Facebook Live and you were interacting with people and you were there, or you were on YouTube Live and you were talking back and forth and da-da-da. And then the recording, but after that, the recording is available from then on. So that's one thing. Or you pre-record something, you just video yourself doing something, but there's no audience, and then you put that up on the internet. That is also counts as recording. It doesn't count as virtual because you're not live. There's not what they call synchronous, but it's not live with an audience. So those are the two categories for recorded programming. They end up, then we have two questions. First is, how many programs did you do? And the second is, how many views did you get? How many programs did you do? Relatively straightforward. Each story time counts as a different program. Each whatever counts as a different program. How many views? So the views are somewhat complicated. In general, we are tracking, because this is what IMLS asks for, tracking views in the first 7 days since you made it live. In most of I have some things that can help you find that number, but basically we want it in the first 7 days because IMLS is sort of treating it as a analog for programming, so it needs to be topical, and that's why they don't want it to last forever. However, it is a little bit complicated to do that. So for Facebook, we want people who viewed it for at least a minute. It's not every person who starts it and stops it. We want at least a minute. In other things, we generally want unique views. And I have some, again, I have some advice on how to track those numbers from that we've worked on a federal level that I will put on our website, but it's not really up there yet. So that's recorded programming. Next is self-directed activities, which is also called passive programming, but we like self-directed a lot better, so we're using that. It is programs that you make for people to do, but not in an active back and forth kind of way. You put something that they take home. Take home stuff is sort of the primo, but you can also, there's cases where you could do things on social media, trivia. Story walks is also another category that is self-directed. Basically, we think that it required a moderate amount of staff work to make it happen. So like coloring, if you photocopy coloring sheets, that's not included. That's great, but it's not included here because you didn't have to do enough work. But if you draw and make coloring sheets, then that's definitely a bunch of work. If you make a story walk, that's obviously a ton of work. Take home packets, that's a ton of work. Any of those where you put a bunch of work into it, we want to know. So what we're counting is the activities. And each time it's if you completely rework it, that's a new activity. If you like change one thing, that's not a new activity. So we want to know how many activities you did. We want a brief description of what kind of activities you did. And then we want a roughly how many people do you think participated? For take homes, that's obviously not terribly difficult. You can probably get a handle on it. For things like story walks, it's going to require some speculation, and that's just how it is. This number requires, it's going to be a broad estimate. We totally know it. Just do your best. Do a number that you feel somewhat confident about. If somebody asked, like from your town or from your board, how many people would you guess did it? You will make you can use that number. So self-directed activities. That's that. Next, let's see, non-library sponsored programs. So how many programs were held? This number probably went down during COVID. Were held in your building that you didn't sponsor, you were not really involved in. Basically, people using your space. This we added last year, I think, and previously it didn't get included. We don't need to know how many people are there. We just want to know how many times they came. So if you have a Cub Scouts that come once a month, that's 12. Bam. And again, probably went down during COVID. But the best you can do for people, non-library sponsored programs that are held in the building that you didn't really have much to do with, they're just held there. Okay, next is deliveries. These used to be called outreach, but it's really asking about deliveries. So in 3 categories, and for deliveries, we want to know, I made a delivery, not how many items you delivered. It's just a delivery. The first one is to individuals' homes. I made a delivery to a patron's home and dropped off X amount of books. That's great. That's the answer is 1 each time, and it's 1, and it doesn't matter whether they're circulating books, like they are going to come back, or freebies that you're not getting back. Either way, it counts as 1. The next is childcare providers and centers. So this is frequently what ends up happening with outreach, is people go to childcare places or something like that. The last one is everywhere else, which is schools most prominently, but anywhere else that that this gets done, this is where it goes. So again, these are the number of deliveries, not the number of items. Okay, next, in the home stretch, computer services. This is the number of computers or tablets that are usable by the public for general use going on the internet, basically is what it really cares about. So if you have an OPAC that is really only supposed to be used as an OPAC, that doesn't count. If you have a computer that's used for Ancestry and nothing else, that shouldn't count. We just want to know things that people can get on the internet. If you have computers that are usable inside the building, like somebody comes and uses a laptop, they can use it anywhere, they can walk around with it, that counts. So that is that. This is just a number. Boom. Next one. We changed up. We had this question about helping patrons one-on-one with technology. And we tried, it was incredibly vague, and in fact used to include staff as well. So I grabbed one from a different state, Rhode Island, I think, that has more clarity. So again, so the question is, it's basically whenever you have a slightly involved interaction with a staff, or with a patron, trying to teach them something on the computer. How do I use the mouse? How do I use the my Facebook? How do I use the social media, etc.? How do I do email? How do I get to something? It's if you talk to them for 10 seconds, that probably doesn't count. But if you talk to them for 2 minutes, that probably does count. It is sort of this. These all should count as reference transactions as well, because it really is a reference transaction. But we're trying to kind of pull out these as well. And again, the old question didn't have a lot of clarity, so we wanted to add this. I know that you might not have this number because we sort of changed the way that this is asked, but we're trying to capture people giving computer help with patrons. Okay, so that's sheet 35. Next is, how many times were your computers used by patrons during the year? This is a total. Again, ideally, it's an every time that somebody goes on, you get a check mark, or there's signing in, or they have there's a reservation system, or some other way that you are capturing every time that somebody's on a public machine. If not, you can do the estimate process where you do a week and you do another week, and you multiply that times 26, and that gets you an estimate. It also asks how many people, whether it's an estimate or it's an annual count. Okay, next, how many wireless sessions do you have? This is a number that if you have some technological way to capture this, like you can, and it's sometimes easy, depending on your router and setup. It can be very easy or very hard or impossible to get. But so basically, you get that number. If you don't have an electronic way, it would be very hard to get this number. If you have a sense that you feel confident in, that you are like checking off when people are there, if you're confident enough in it, then give it to us. But if you don't feel like you have a good sense, do not hesitate to say, no, I don't have it. There's not an easy way to get it from our router. This is something that we are constantly, on a national level, are trying to make easier, trying to come up with solutions. At this point, we don't have great solutions that make it just magically easier, but we keep working on it. Again, is this an actual count or an estimate? That's another thing you could do. And then, okay, we used to ask you what your ILS software was. We don't anymore, but there is a Google form. If you click on this link, it'll take you to Google form, or a Google spreadsheet. It will tell you how many, it'll tell you what everybody's ILS is. If it's wrong, let me know and I'll fix it. So that's there. And then the last normal question is, how many visits have you had to your website? Last year, IMLS asked this. So ideally, you're looking for sessions. Depending on your website provider, this could be really easy, really hard, or actually impossible. So do your best, but it's if you can't get it, do not worry about it at all. It is not by far is not the most important question in the report. So yes, so that's that. That is the end of services. Do people have questions about services? If you do, unmute yourself or put something in the chat, please. We're going to, just to, as a heads up, we're going to finish the rest of the report, which is just little bits and pieces, and then we're going to come out and cover more general stuff in 1 second. But okay, so I'm going to run through the rest of the report, which again, at this point you have finished the majority of the report, but there are a few like last minute things. Okay, first off, in a report, final questions and signature. This is basically saying, yes, everything in here is right. Your name, your title, position, and your date. There's actually even it's also telling us who filled it out, which is important. Next, certification. This is the one where you're really saying it. You're saying, yes, we did our best. This is the information to the best of our knowledge. So the librarian puts their name and the date, and then the chairperson on the board of trustees. If for whatever reason the chairperson is not available, you can use somebody else on the board. But we want somebody on the board to say, yes, these numbers are accurate. So that's that. Okay, then here's some instructions on how to finish up. But I forgot L. So our very last thing is a bunch of yes/no pandemic questions. They're pretty straightforward, but it's basically about, did any of these things happen during the reporting period that we're talking about? Was the library ever physically closed? Did staff work with patrons while the library was physically closed? Did you provide Wi-Fi outside the building intentionally? Okay. So that's that. I realized that there were a couple of, I didn't do any general questions about how to work on the survey. So I'm going to do those real quick and then we'll hop back. Okay, so this is the survey interface. You should, to move around, you can do one of two things. You can hit the next and previous buttons, or you could use this navigation over on the left to jump around. What you don't want to use is the forward and backward buttons in your browser, because the system is set to automatically save your page whenever you hit save or whenever you hit previous or next. But if you just hit forward or back, one, you might lose data, and two, it might start being weird, acting weird. It doesn't, the portal just gets weird when you use forward and back. So just don't, try to train yourself not to use these. Instead, use previous, next, save, move around back and forth. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. I did not, I mentioned earlier, but didn't mention again, show last year's answers. I would always have this here. It's always helpful to see what you said last year. And it's just, as long as you fill out the report last year, your information will appear. So I would always have that there. What do we do when we're done? Or when we think we're done? I'm going to actually talk about that on the PowerPoint because I think it is going to be a little clearer in there. So, okay, I'm going to, this is me wrapping up with the report part of the report. Does anybody have questions about anything inside the report? I guess inside the report itself is sort of what I'm saying. Sort of the nuts and bolts pieces.
Josh, I had another question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back to the library patron question, I had put it in the chat, but I wanted to just draw.
Oh, thank you.
I'm asking, do library patrons, like other libraries who are our patrons that are in our database that are registered with us, we, mostly for ILL purposes, do they count as total registered patrons, or do we leave out, quote unquote, like library patrons?
So if possible, you should leave those out.
Okay.
Anything that's like not really a patron or is a institutional patron or something like that, if you can get that number, ideally you would remove it.
Yeah, that's totally possible to do that with Destiny. Okay, thank you.
If but so that covers in general. If there's ever things that are not real patrons, ideally remove them. If it's not possible, because if it's just a thing that is not really doable in your ILS, it's not the most important thing in the world. But if you can, that would be great.
Okay, that's easy to do. Thank you.
Thank you much. All right, so let's, I'm going to stop sharing this and.
Josh?
Yes.
I do have a comment to make that maybe a lot of new people don't understand. Is in section K, when you get sent back, it's almost like having to redo it and reapply and go back to section K again and make sure that it's recorded.
Yes. Okay. So yes. So let me hop through that. So what happens is, hold on, I'm trying to figure out the most coherent way to get to that. Okay. So yes. So what's going to happen is you're going to you're going to feel like you're done. You're going to have gotten to the end of the report. So what you want to do at that point is the first you think you've put all the data in there. You want to click Show Status, and this tells you if there's any place that you didn't fill in or any place where there's what's called an edit check. Edit checks happen when the system thinks that the number that you entered doesn't make sense compared to what you entered last year or possibly just in general. So you will come to this page. Again, you'll think that you probably put everything in, and you did, but there might be things that you need to tweak or add comments to. So here are the three options: edit checks, unanswered questions, and flag questions. Okay, so we'll go in reverse order. Flag questions is whenever there's a little spot to put a red flag on a question, that is for you. That's just to remind you to go back to it. So if you do that, they will show up here. Unanswered questions are any questions that are required that you haven't answered. So you go through and you'll say, oh, I didn't do that one on section C, or I didn't do that one on section K, and you'll get them. And then slightly more complicated is edit checks. So edit checks happen because the system thinks your number doesn't make sense. And it may, in fact, make total sense. So you'd be prepared for them. They don't mean you did something wrong. They often just mean that the system thinks that it's weird, but it's not really weird. You just have to explain why it is what it is. Sometimes the explanation is that is the number. So you can always, if you ever have any weirdness, you can always get in touch with me about it. In fact, I recommend it. So you'll go through and it will have this red text over here that says something is wrong. This is what we think is wrong. And then it will say, here's what you can do to fix it. You can either, if you think that number is wrong, you should change it. But if you don't, you can put in a note that explains why that number looks like it does. It will always say a federal note or a state note. So a federal note over here says federal note, and you'll say, we were closed for COVID, so that's why these numbers are low. Or we had a staff change, so something happened, so we didn't do any YA programs this year, or whatever. And you put it in here, and you're good. And you'll just scroll down. It'll give you everything that it thinks is wrong. You will put notes in them. You will come down to the bottom, and it'll say save. At that point, you will, once again, it'll look like everything is ready to go. Once they're all gone, once they've all been resolved, not gone, I'm sorry. Once they've all been resolved, you will click submit, and it will tell you, yep, everything's great. And you will hit submit again, and then it's done. The report is complete at that point. It's very easy to get to a point where you think that you have finished the report and it is not done. So A, kind of just be aware of that fact, but also B, feel free to say, I think I finished, and just email me and I can go in and see if it's really done. And in many cases, there's just some like little squirrely thing that where you wouldn't need to do anything. I can just do it and take care of it. But you want to be aware of that fact. And the issue is you may think that you submitted it, but I don't know that because it will only tell me if you finished it. It'll just look like you're still in progress. So again, there's this little, even after you think you're done, there's these other steps that you think that you have to jump through. There's a few more, there's always a couple more hoops. This is a short version. And it kind of talks you through that, but definitely if you get to that point and you have any uncertainty, contact me and we will walk through it. Let's see, any other questions sort of about the report process and portal and things like that? There's still a bunch of sort of general stuff that well, not a bunch, but a chunk of it that I'm going to whip through, and I want to get to general questions as well. Okay, so I'm going to advance. I'm going to start sharing the end of the PowerPoint. Oh, you know what? I'm going to try to share it the other way and see if that makes this any easier. Okay. Okay. And Wait. Wow, it's been a while since I've been in. Oh, slideshow. Sorry, it's been a while since I've been presenting a PowerPoint. Okay. So edit checks. I just talked about edit checks. Again, if you ever have questions about them, please get in touch, because in many cases there's nothing wrong. So and even if there is something, it's just something weird. So in many cases it's sort of a false positive, and we just need to put text in there to tell the system that. But if you have questions, let me know. Final steps, we sort of talked about that, putting your name, certifying it. Okay, briefly, I'm going to talk about what happens after you submit. You fill out the form completely. You responded to all the edit checks. You certified the form. You've done everything, and then you hit submit, and it tells you, it gives you 3 green check marks, boop, 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 and you hit submit again, and it's actually submitted. At that point, it lets me know. So what I'm going to do this year, which I have not done previously, is as soon as everybody's done and we get that first deadline, I'm going to send the draft data out to everybody, for anybody, in the hopes that it may be useful to folks who still have any. So that'll be January 15th, 16th, in case anybody needs that information for anything around town meeting day. So we're going to send that out. However, at that point, I start wrestling with the data that everybody has submitted, and I put it into the IMLS portal. It's a sort of back and forth process. The same edit checks that you have, I have a bunch of other ones that I sort of have to work my way through and make tiny little tweaks. There's a lot of turning zeros into -1s, and turning -1s into zeros, and turning them both into nothings. And eventually the system accepts the whole thing. IMLS asks if they have any questions about what I've submitted, and usually there's a couple of minor things. Then finally, state librarian certifies it, and it's complete, at which point I start working on not the draft version, but the official version, and then make those available to everyone. Here are a few notes that probably should be much earlier than this, but I have them at the end. One at a time. I recommend not either having 2 people in at the same time in the report, checked into the portal at the same time, and that includes me. So if I'm going to look at your thing, we want to make sure that you're not in it at the same time. That also means if you have 2 tabs open on the report, I don't recommend that either. Because of the way that it saves things, it's really easy to overwrite if there's 2 people in there. Every time you move back and forth, you may overwrite what somebody else is doing. So I recommend never having more than 1 person and never having more than 1 tab going. Browser buttons. We talked about browser buttons before. Don't use the browser buttons. Use previous and next. You'll just be happier. Browsers. From what we can tell, Google Chrome and recent versions of Microsoft Edge seem to work best if you happen to have those available. Mozilla Firefox mostly works, but sometimes seems to have quirks. Old versions of Microsoft Edge, which you may not have at this point, but if you did, I would recommend avoiding. Safari, I think, is like Firefox, and it sometimes has quirks as well. So if you can control what you're using, it's great to jump that. But if you don't have control, if you have to use a certain one, just be prepared that occasionally something weird might happen. All right, that's that. We talked about, oh, and then this is changes, which we've already talked about. Okay, so that is the end. Here, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so that is basically the end of this. So that, oh, I did say, again, I'm going to reiterate this. Thank you so much for being a part of the report. I'm not ending. I'm sorry. This isn't the end. I just want to make sure that I remember to thank everybody for being a part of the report. I know that you're super busy and definitely don't have time to do a giant report. And I appreciate that everyone makes time to do it so thoroughly. It means a lot to me. And correspondingly, anything that I can do to make it less hard on you, I want to. So never, ever, ever hesitate to get in touch with me if you have any questions about the report, or if it's not doing what you think, or if you have a question where you don't know what to do with it. Please always do that. Always, always, always. I've said this before, I think, but I would rather get 10 emails from you than discover that you just spent 2 hours hitting your head against the wall trying to get something to fit into somewhere. Don't do that, please. So that is, that's basically what I prepared. So general questions, anything that you want to know that I didn't say or that I didn't say clearly, or anybody who is, anybody who has done the report before that has other things they want to mention, the floor is everyone's. So I will reiterate, you are definitely going to end up with weird little outliers that don't fit neatly into one of the questions. You should, you can always use your judgment, but always feel free to ask me, because however much, you know, we have frequently asked questions and I have tutorials, but there's going to be something that's going to fall between the cracks, and there's not going to be a good answer on what do I do in the case of X. So you use your judgment, but always feel free to ask.
Josh.
Yeah.
This is Colleen Bushway again. I usually help whoever's the librarian at the time. Right now it's Janet Mano. So I'm also a trustee. Is it okay for me to go on that last page, and because I'm not the chair, but I am the trustee that helped?
Yes, I think that makes perfect sense. I would definitely do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, let's see. Any other things that I've learned over the years that are briefly worth doing? Oh, I don't think I said this. But I should have opened with it. I apologize. The report is big and a lot of work. As much as possible, I know this is an impossible request, but as much as possible, try not to stress over it. It gets done. The report gets done. It requires a ton of work, and I'm so appreciative of that. But know that it will get done, and try not to stress about very individual questions or specific pieces of data you don't have, or just things like that. As long as if there's a done report at the end of the year, that's 80% of the way there. That's what we want. If there's little nuggets of data that are a little different than maybe it asked, or there's something that you don't have or something like that, that's fine. Do not worry about it as much as possible. Try not to stress about the report. You can still complain about the report till you're as much as you want, because it's totally valid. But try not to stress about it, because we all get through it. It all happens annoyingly, but it happens, and it will get done. And done is what it needs to be. So, yeah. All right. Any more questions? We have a web page on our site that's specifically devoted to the report. It gives a bunch of general information that you probably just heard from me, but there's also some other stuff in there. There's this PowerPoint is in there. There's a page that is frequently asked questions, which might have answers, but you can, for what you're asking, but always, you can just come straight to me. You don't need to pour through the whole thing to find out your answer. There's a list that has, what am I supposed to track? There's a page that has help on getting online resource, how to get data stats for some of the online resources, and that's where I'm going to put the information that I have for Listen Up Vermont /Overdrive. I just got that from GMLC person shared that with me, so I'm going to put that up there so you can get that info there. And yeah, so I think that's it. Again, any last thoughts or questions? I really, really appreciate everybody's time, and I know that everybody is super booked up, and that this is one more thing on your plate. And I'm always amazed at what an amazing job everybody does with it, knowing that you don't have time for it. And again, anything that I can do to try to make it just a smidge better or clearer is great. And if you ever have suggestions about anything, much of the time it's like it is because we can't change it, but we can always change the context around it. We can always, if there's things that I'm not explaining clearly, or that are not clear, or that aren't clear in the report, please let me know. I won't take it personally. The better I can make it, the happier I am. So if there are any more questions, I'm going to close it up. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I hope that everybody has a great rest of their Monday. And thanks for taking time for this. The recordings will be online probably in a day or two. I can't imagine you want to sit through them again, but if you did, there they are. So that's it. Thanks, everybody. I'm stopping the recording now. And